Mic check, 1, 2.
Ready? Committee will please come to order. Quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 2574, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, and H.R. 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act of 2019. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11, the Rules of the House, and Committee Rule 13B. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 1, and without objection, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. 65 years ago tomorrow, the United States Supreme Court unanimously struck down unlawful school segregation in the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. In a unanimous decision, the court noted that, and I quote, "In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms." Chief Justice Warren went on to write that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Yet more than 6 decades later, the promise of this landmark ruling has not been fulfilled. According to a 2016 Government Accountability Office report, public schools are now more segregated by race and class today than at any time since the 1960s. Just last week, researchers at UCLA and Penn State revealed that the share of racially segregated schools has tripled to nearly 20% since the 1980s. That's 1 in 5 schools in America where students in the school are both of color and low income. History and evidence demonstrate that protecting civil rights in education is a necessity for expanding opportunities of students historically disadvantaged by systemic discrimination. Strong federal support for school integration policies in the 1970s and 80s cut the achievement gap in half in just 17 years. More recently, a report from Rucker C. Johnson of the University of California in Berkeley, considered the most rigorous and comprehensive to date, showed that black students who attend desegregated schools throughout their K-12 career are more likely to graduate from high school, attend college, and complete college. Today, we're considering 2 bills, H.R. 2574, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, and H.R. 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act, that honor the important holding of Brown v. Board of Education and take important steps towards making equity in education a reality for students across the country. The first bill, Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, would secure the right of students, parents, and communities to address racial inequities in public school under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under the Civil Rights Act, individuals had the right to challenge discriminatory public school policies if those practices disproportionately hurt marginalized students on the basis of race, color, or national origin. However, in 2001, the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in Alexander v. Sandoval struck down the right of individuals to challenge such policies or practice under Title VI of the law. In sum, the decision barred victims of civil rights violations from pursuing justice against entities who were federally funded but engaged in practices or carried out policies that disparately impacted racial groups. The victims of discrimination now have to wait for the Department of Education to take action, and if the department fails to act, nothing happens. In response, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act restores the private right of action of students and parents and communities to bring lawsuits against inequities in education. The legislation is also designates an Assistant Secretary of Education to oversee equity and inclusion programs. And finally, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act creates Title VI monitors, similar to Title IX monitors now in effect for complaints of sex discrimination and sexual harassment and violence, to ensure that every school has at least one employee specifically designated to investigate complaints of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. The second bill, the Strength and Diversity Act, introduced by Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, provides public school districts the tools to develop voluntary, community-driven strategies for promoting diversity. Recognizing the long-lasting benefits of school diversity for students, some districts have now developed their own initiatives for desegregation. Yet, developing programs may be complicated. In fact, in 2 locations, Kentucky and Washington, the Supreme Court actually struck down voluntary school desegregation plans. And when the when the Trump administration came in, the Department of Education eliminated the voluntary Opening Doors, Expanding Opportunities grant program, which was designed to support districts seeking to pursue locally driven strategies to increase school diversity. To restore federal support for school integration, the Strength and Diversity Act dedicates funding for communities to study racial isolation in their schools and tackle segregation through evidence-based plans. Unfortunately, the House rules prevented this bill from taking the additional step of eliminating a nearly 5 decades-old prohibition on using federal funds to desegregate schools by helping students travel to and from school. However, this bill is a step in the right direction by nullifying the prohibition as it applies to the Strength and Diversity Act and allowing federal funding under the bill to go towards transportation for the purpose of integration. The legacy of systemic inequality and racial segregation continues to deny millions of children the opportunity to reach their full potential. Instead of confronting this injustice, the federal government has continually retreated from its role in promoting school diversity, erasing decades of progress towards educational equity. These 2 bills will help reverse that trend. 65 years after the landmark decision of Brown v. Board, we must continue to commit to finally delivering on its promise. I therefore urge my colleagues to support the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act and the Strength and Diversity Act. I now yield to the distinguished ranking member from North Carolina, Dr. Fox, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. As I reviewed the legislation we're here to consider, it became clear that the question before us today is not one of equality for all children. That's simply, thankfully, no longer a question. It never should have been. Separate is not and was never equal. Racism is wrong, segregation is wrong. While its place in the law is finally over, its lingering effects are not. As we've noted several times during this Congress, changes to the law do not mean changes to individual hearts and minds. The question before us this morning is whether the solutions offered in these bills will stand the test of time. The question is whether in the long run these ideas will have helped or hurt the ongoing effort to achieve greater equality for children. I do not disagree in the slightest with the intentions behind these bills. but have major reservations about their efficacy. In our spirited hearing marking the anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which was 65 years ago tomorrow, we heard from witnesses who presented some diverse viewpoints on the best ways to advance racial equality in America's schools. The hearing was informative, passionate, and proved to be a truly educational experience for committee members. Many of us came away even stronger in our convictions that each child is unique and worthy of having individualized educational opportunities tailored to his or her development and success. Access to opportunities, freedom to climb. These are the aspects of a student's education that must be equal for all children nationwide. No one-size-fits-all structure can deliver on all those essentials. Separate was never equal, but equality simply cannot mean uniformity. Equality is affirming that all children are fundamentally the same in dignity, importance, and worth, but also understanding that not all children's needs are the same. Our Democrat colleagues' good intentions have resulted in short-sighted legislation. H.R. 2574, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, and H.R. 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act, make more political points than principled, building upon past bipartisan, bicameral solutions. If we really want to work toward integration and equality, principles we all agree are critical to our children's success, then amended legislation focusing on greater fairness for all students is required. The improvements Republicans will propose to these two bills will streamline their enforcement to help minimize undue bureaucratic influence while ensuring that recipients of federal education funding are complying with civil rights laws. As written, the bills promise new federal spending, which experienced members of this body know full well usually fails to materialize, resulting in more broken promises and frustration for educators, administrators, students, and families. Republicans have come to the table today with common sense solutions that build upon existing successful compromises. The Republican improvements to H.R. 2574 and H.R. 2639 will show there is much we agree on with our Democrat colleagues. But we also want to ensure policy that has long-lasting positive impact. All children deserve an excellent education and expanded opportunities. The legacy of Brown v. Board of Education should be to increase access to these opportunities and empower parents to choose the best educational tracks for their children. Brown v. Board was about eliminating the ability of the state to consign children to low-performing schools with no means of escape. Committee Republicans have promoted bipartisan initiatives like opportunity zones and expanded school choice as ways to lift communities and unleash opportunity and success. When Democrats are ready to work with us, we want nothing more than to see all American children prosper. I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day. House rules require a copy of the measures to be considered for markup to be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. Copies were made available pursuant to those rules. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill, H.R. 2574, for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2574 to amend Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to restore the right to individual civil actions in cases involving disparate impact and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with. Now we come to second reading. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment open shall be considered as read. Now I recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2574, offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes minor changes to the bill. It amends the title of the bill in Section 1, clarifies the role played by the Assistant Secretary for Equity and Inclusion in Section 4, and I urge members to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute and the underlying bill. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion in the amendment in the nature of a substitute? I'm sorry, Mr. Comer.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. Okay. All right.
Let's, if there's comment on the amendment nature of substitute,
Okay.
then we'll get to amendments. If the gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quality public education is a powerful force for economic and social mobility, but too often students of color and low-income students face disparate outcomes in our education system because they've been cut off from the education they deserve, in part because of the rise of racially and socioeconomically isolated schools in our country. As we honor the 65th anniversary of the historic Brown versus Board of Education decision, we must also acknowledge our country's failure to fulfill the promise of this landmark case. Because despite progress in the 1970s and 80s through strong federal support to integrate schools, unfortunately today, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, we are seeing the resegregation of schools. We need to do more to deliver on the promise of an equitable, world-class public education for every student, and to do this, it's essential that we protect the civil rights of all students. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has shown hostility toward efforts to diversify schools. It's made efforts to remove the use of disparate impact regulations and has repeatedly rolled back critical guidance that protected students' civil rights. We must affirm our collective commitment to Brown by holding this administration accountable, by enforcing federal civil rights laws, and by supporting local efforts to end inequities and integrate public schools. The committee's work today is an important step toward achieving these goals by requiring the Department of Education to appoint a special assistant for equity and inclusion, tasked with coordinating, promoting, and evaluating Title VI enforcement of equity and inclusion in education, and creating a federal grant program to support the development, implementation, or expansion of local efforts to promote racial and socioeconomic diversity in schools. I'm proud to support these bills, and I'm grateful to my colleagues, Chairman Scott, Representative Sablan, Representative Fudge, for their leadership in moving these bills forward. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment in the nature of a substitute and the underlying bill text, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other comments? Gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
65 years after Brown v. Board of Education, we still find ourselves with segregated schools and policies that were put in place that cause inequities in our schools. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is one of the most important tools for tackling discrimination and segregation, especially in our public schools. As we all know, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin. This includes policies that will disproportionately impact students of color. And that is why the Obama administration issued school discipline guidance in 2014. The sole purpose was to ensure that schools remember their legal obligation to ensure school discipline is free from discrimination, regardless of the intent. A 2018 GAO report requested by Chairman Scott found that black students, boys, and students with disabilities were disproportionately disciplined in K-12 schools. This is happening across the country in cities like Chicago, Memphis, and New York City, proving that we need the strengthened guidance now more than ever. During the previous hearing on Brown, we all heard from the Chancellor of the New York City Schools, Richard Carranza, who echoed the sentiment that policies are in place that are having a disparate impact on disadvantaged students, including discipline, attendance, and enrollment practices. While this administration is relaxing its responsibilities to ensure protections under Title VI and rescinding critical guidance, I'm proud that this committee is taking up legislation that will strengthen and ensure civil rights protections for all students. This bill ensures that schools are compliant and enforcing Title VI as the law intended through the creation of civil rights monitors and enforcers. Now, while I understand that it will take a multi-tiered approach to end segregation and discrimination in schools, this bill brings much-needed oversight and accountability, which is a step forward. Now, I urge my colleagues to join me in support of H.R. 2574. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other comments? Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a proud co-sponsor of yours and Chairman Nadler's Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, and I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to mark up this important bill on the 65th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. The United States reached the height of school desegregation in 1988 when 44% of African American students attended integrated schools, and now it is under 25%. Today, more than 20 million students of color, specifically 50% of African American students, are attending racially and socioeconomically isolated public schools. And that trend is reflected in my own district. In Seattle's public schools, we have the biggest white-black achievement gap in the state and the 5th biggest achievement gap among the nation's 200 largest school districts. It is clear that student achievement is uneven along racial lines, and 65 years after our Supreme Court decided that segregated schools are unconstitutional, we still promote policies that discriminate against students of color. I would argue, Mr. Chairman, that our responsibility as legislators is to address this crisis through a strategy called targeted universalism that John C. Powell, who's the director of the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley, has been promoting. And it basically just means setting universal goals that can be achieved through targeted approaches. A big part of this is considering how institutional structures and other factors are hurting our progress towards this universal goal and addressing these in a systemic way. Our universal goal here is to achieve a nation where our children's educational outcomes are not determined by their zip codes. In order to achieve that outcome, we have to consider the significant structural barriers that we are facing. Over 200 years of slavery, followed by laws at the federal, state, and local level intended to perpetuate injustices, particularly against Black Americans. This includes sharecropping, convict leasing, legal segregation, housing redlining, labor laws that exclude people of color from accepted worker protections, disproportionate application of criminal justice, predatory financial practices, and unequal education. This bill, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, is the targeted policy response that we need to help achieve a goal that we all share, for all children, regardless of their zip code, to have a top-notch integrated education. This bill would empower parents and communities victimized by structural discrimination by amending the Civil Rights Act to restore the right to families and communities to file disparate impact claims and provide students with adequate remedies for civil rights violations. We need big, bold solutions to work towards a country where we emphasize social justice and racial studies in our schools. We need anti-racist classrooms and pedagogies to empower all students, including our students of color. And we need restorative justice, not zero-tolerance discipline. We need to recruit, support, and retain teachers of every race so that students have a diversity of mentors of many backgrounds. But we can't do any of that if we don't legally empower the people impacted by structural discrimination to fight for their rights. And so, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this bill. I urge my colleagues to vote for this bill, which would proactively address the school segregation crisis that we have in our country today. That's a targeted solution to work for that universal goal of equity in education that we all share. I'm proud to vote for this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized for discussion of the amendment nature of substitute? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. one of the joys of representative government is you represent people. So I went back to the people that I represent, and I asked them what they thought about this bill, and several of my school districts were able to get back to me in time. And rather than me speaking, why don't I allow the Frisco Independent School District, who I have the joy of representing, to speak. And their concerns about this bill was, quote, could result in a number of meritless lawsuits being filed and school districts having to pay the cost of defending those suits. Increasing the legal fees of a school district only punishes the student and educators of the school district, who may then have access to fewer resources and to ensure ideal class size, well-paid teachers, and high-quality programs. So while the intent of this legislation is something I certainly agree with, I'm concerned that the instrument that we're using will enrich lawyers and at the detriment of students and teachers. So respectfully, I'm going to vote no on this legislation, but I look forward to working with the chairman and other members to try to address this particular issue. I'm fortunate to represent a very diverse district that is very racially integrated across the board. So this is not a problem in my district, but I certainly have benefited in my own educational experience of being in integrated schools. I think that's something that's important. I think that's a very good objective. I just am concerned, as I read from what Frisco ISD said, that what this is doing is helping lawyers and not helping students. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other members that want to be recognized on the amendment A for substitute? If not, are there amendments? I'm sorry, gentleman from Wisconsin, recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll just make a couple comments on both bills, which affect the amendments. First of all, I'm glad we had the hearing. You always learn stuff with every hearing. I'm struck that we're a little bit ignoring the testimony of Deon Pierce, who was one of the people who we were able to hear from. In his testimony, he mentioned two things that he thought were in part responsible for underperforming schools: high rates of family dysfunction and a, quote, mainstream culture which encourages transgressive behavior. I think it's a difficult thing for this committee to address either one of those problems, but I think to look at statistics that we'd like to change over the next 10 or 20 years requires us to look at both of these issues and see what we can do. I'd like to second the comments of Congressman Taylor. I've dealt with the type of lawyers who deal with this before. Usually the cost of the lawyers and the cost of the lawsuit gets borne by the school districts that are being sued. And that's what's happened in the past in Wisconsin. Final comment to make, I think sometimes there's an inference that there's a difference in spending or resources in some schools than the other. At least in the state of Wisconsin, I checked, the 4 school districts that have the highest number of minority population all spend significantly more than the average school in the state of Wisconsin, so I don't think that's the problem. But in any event, I'd like to thank the chairman for bringing these bills forward and having a hearing on these issues.
Thank you. The other comments? If not, gentleman from Kentucky, do you have an amendment?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2574, offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Does the gentlelady from Connecticut reserve a point of order?
Mr. Chair, I want to reserve a point of order on this amendment.
Gentlelady from Connecticut reserves a point of order. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act offered by Chairman Scott is well-intentioned. We all agree that discrimination and state-sanctioned segregation are repugnant, illegal, and blatantly immoral. And we recognize that there's more work to be done to ensure equal access to quality education for all Americans. Unfortunately, the Democrats' underlying bill will just spur more litigation rather than advance the needs of students and parents. Instead of working with us to ensure the Department of Education staff is structured in a way that ensures the enforcement of all civil rights laws, Democrats included a provision in their bill meant to expand the department's bureaucracy. This substitute is simple and shows there is much we agree on. We agree that recipients of federal education funds should designate someone on staff to coordinate compliance with civil rights laws. We agree on having staff to advise the Secretary of Education on efforts to promote equity and inclusion and ensuring the department's commitment to federal civil rights laws. The substitute amendment corrects the flaws in H.R. 2574 that would increase bureaucratic reach while focusing on our areas of agreement. The majority has promised to pursue bipartisan solutions when possible. This amendment presents the majority a chance to show the rhetoric is real. If we really want to honor the legacy of one of the most important Supreme Court cases in our history, it's critical that we enact legislation with long-standing positive impact. I'm confident that this substitute brings us closer to that. I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment.
Thank you. Does anyone want to speak on the amendment? If not, I recognize myself. One of the problems with the amendment is that it strikes the private right of action. That is a significant portion of the bill. It leaves communities at the whim of the Department of Education. If they don't bring a case, nothing gets done. And therefore, I would oppose the amendment. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, does the, I'm sorry. Okay. Gentlelady from Connecticut, do you insist on your point of order?
I do insist.
And does anyone want to speak to the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will, gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
If the gentleman would withhold for just a minute, what is the basis of the point of order?
The amendment offered by the gentleman makes changes to a portion of the bill text outside of this committee's jurisdiction. As such, the amendment could not withstand a Rule 10 committee jurisdiction point of order.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, do you wish to speak on the point of order?
I do.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the ranking member, Ms. Fox.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleague from Kentucky. Mr. Chairman, I acknowledge that this amendment removes a provision that is not in our committee's jurisdiction. I believe this situation underlines the point we have been making. The majority could have worked with us and brought forward bipartisan legislation in our committee's jurisdiction. Instead, you're moving forward on a relatively small part of a bill that has significant implications for the Judiciary Committee rather than having the Judiciary Committee move first. The provision we removed in our substitute had not been vetted, and our committee cannot begin to fully understand all of its implications. It's irresponsible for our committee to vote on a bill that includes a provision we have no expertise on. The gentleman is obligated to rule this amendment out of order, but I hope the gentleman would be willing to truly seek bipartisan solutions when they are available in the future. And I yield back.
Thank you. The chair is prepared to rule. The gentlewoman has made a point of order that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kentucky makes changes to a portion of the bill outside the committee's jurisdiction. The chair takes note of the fact that H.R. 2574 was referred to the Speaker to the Committee on the Judiciary in addition to the Committee on Education and Labor, in each case for consideration of such provisions as fall within the jurisdiction of the committee concerned. Parliamentary precedent as it relates to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is clear that only the Committee on the Judiciary can mark up amendments to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And the gentleman's amendment makes changes to a portion of the bill to amend Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and for that reason, and for the reasons articulated by the gentlelady from North Carolina, the point of order against the amendment is sustained. Are there other amendments? No other amendments. The question now occurs on the amendment in nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in nature of substitute will say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The gentlelady from Connecticut, do you have a motion?
I move to lay the, actually, no. No. Right? No. I don't think so. Yeah. Mr. Chair, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 2574 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs in the reporting of H.R. 2574's amendment to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, we request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested pursuant to committee rules. Further proceedings on the bill shall be postponed. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill H.R. 2639 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance. Printed copies are available in your folders, and the clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2639 to establish the Strength and Diversity Program and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill will be now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize the gentlelady from Ohio to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment in the nature
You
of...
have an amendment at the desk?
I have an amendment at the
The
desk.
clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2639 offered by Ms. Fudge of Ohio.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered as original text and open for amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in your folders, and I recognize Ms. Fudge for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment in the nature of a substitute makes several substantive improvements to portions of the Strength in Diversity Act, including the following. It improves provisions under Section 5 to ensure outreach to parents and students in a language that parents and students can understand. It also ensures consultation with students and families in the district or region targeted for diversity improvement efforts. The amendment expands planning grant activities under Section 6 to include development of a robust family, student, and community engagement plan. It also explicitly states that funds can be used to support school districts under a court-ordered desegregation plan. The amendment expands implementation grant activities and includes the development of innovative and equitable school assignment plans. Section 7 adds the reduction of school discipline rates as a measure of school integration success. Section 9 adds language specifying that Section 426 of the General Education Provisions Act does not apply to funds authorized by this bill. Section 426 of GEPA prohibits schools from using funds for transportation to promote school integration. Overall, the Strength and Diversity Act authorizes federal funding for planning and implementation grants to support voluntary local efforts to increase racial and socioeconomic diversity in our nation's schools. The Act also supports school districts independently or in collaboration with neighboring districts, as well as regional educational authorities and education service agencies in their diversity efforts. Research shows integration is the best tool to improve students' outcomes and help ensure future success. After the landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education, America experienced a noticeable decline in educational inequality as schools segregated. Some of the early benefits included narrowing the achievement gap, increasing graduation rates, college attendance, and completion. However, after 1988, schools began to resegregate, and many of the gains in student outcomes slowed or were lost. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office found that public schools had grown more segregated by race and class than at any time since 1960. As the Supreme Court said in Brown, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. We need meaningful solutions to dismantle racial and socioeconomic segregation in America's schools, and the Strength and Diversity Act is a good first step. The act will promote desegregation and elimination of racial and socioeconomic isolation in all of our nation's schools. Once approved by this committee of people of goodwill who have agreed this morning that more needs to be done, we will move closer to investing in inclusive public education and halting the resurgence of segregated schools, programs, and classrooms. I thank Chairman Scott for his support and look forward to working with him to move the bill forward. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others who want to be recognized on the amendment, nature of a substitute. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to first wish an early happy 65th birthday to Brown. With Brown, this country took the first step to make amends for a legacy of discrimination and oppression against African Americans, a legacy whose effects we know all too well we still live with today. But whereas the Supreme Court took the first step to strike down separate but equal, policymakers have seldom done the work it takes to make the Brown decision a living reality. After years of gains, the last 3 decades have been marked by increased racial isolation for Black and Brown students. And unfortunately, in our society, resources and wealth is too often tied to race. The statistics tell the story. Since 1988, the percentage of schools where less than 10% of the student body is white has increased from 6% to 18%. More than half of our nation's school children are in school districts where over 75% of students look just like them. As we know, children who attend segregated schools tend to also come from segregated neighborhoods. The impacts of growing up in a segregated environment are immense for children of color. In areas of high residential segregation, 86% of Black children live in higher poverty neighborhoods than the worst off white children. The figure is 74% for Latino children in highly segregated areas. And we all know how the impacts of entrenched poverty on social mobility and opportunity. So I am happy today that after 30 years of backsliding, after this committee held the first hearing on school integration in 30 years a couple of weeks ago, we will take steps to live up to the legacy of Brown. The Strength and Diversity Act is as good as its title, and I'm happy to be a co-sponsor. Under its provisions, the federal government restores its commitment to school desegregation and restores the commitment to ensuring that every child receive equal opportunity no matter where they grow up, no matter their zip code. Because as Brown told us 65 years ago, separate is inherently unequal. Any child that lives under de facto segregation is not free to live out their dreams, and no one is free until we all are. So I urge this committee to help this nation live up to these ideals and urge strong support for H.R. 2639. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there others wishing to speak on the amendment, nature of a substitute? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
I am proud to speak in support of H.R. 2639, the Strength in Diversity Act, which will move us one step closer to fulfilling the promise of the historic Brown versus Board of Education decision. It is a sad reality that in 2019, 65 years after Brown versus Board was decided, we are still dealing with segregated schools and the unequal opportunities these schools provide to students. We know how vital a strong education is to ensuring that children succeed in life. Let me say it again. We know how vital a strong education is to ensuring that children succeed later in life. Despite the promise of the Brown versus Board decision, our country's progress towards school integration and equal opportunities for all students has been uneven. America's public schools are more segregated today than at any time since the 1960s. We have seen for decades that segregated schools result in segregated opportunity. In my home state of Pennsylvania, we have seen firsthand how failing to fulfill the promise of Brown versus Board is hurting students in the 21st century. Not surprisingly, in my district, most public schools in suburban, predominantly white communities are well-funded, while the schools in communities with a majority of students of color are underfunded. And so the cycle of poverty and inequality continues. The Allentown School District, the third largest school district in Pennsylvania, right in the heart of my district, is facing massive deficits and narrowly avoided a financial crisis last week that would have prevented them from being able to make payroll. What does that tell the teachers who work there? What does that tell the students who attend those schools? It goes without saying that these funding gaps ultimately lead to fewer positive outcomes for students of color and harm entire communities. These disparities in my district reflect the reality of communities across the country where there are areas of concentrated poverty, and the schools in these areas do not have the funding or tax base necessary to provide strong opportunities for their students. Nationwide, we have a $23 billion racial funding gap between school districts serving students of color and school districts serving predominantly white students. According to a 2016 report from the GAO, 61% of all high poverty schools have a majority of Black and Hispanic students. The report also found that schools which are highly racially and socioeconomically segregated have fewer resources. Students at the schools also disproportionately experience more disciplinary actions than students attending diverse schools. It is therefore no surprise that Black students who attend desegregated schools are more likely to graduate from high school, attend college, attend a more selective school, and complete college. That's what happens when they are able to attend desegregated, truly integrated schools. Our schools and communities, and more importantly, our students, deserve better. That's why I'm proud to support the two bills we are marking up today, the Strength and Diversity Act and the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act. Both of these bills will move us closer to fulfilling the promise of educational equity by encouraging school districts to voluntarily desegregate and by strengthening enforcement of civil rights laws. Every student deserves a great education, no matter their race, family income, or zip code. And as I say those words, I believe that I realize that they've almost become trite, because everybody says those words now, at least on the campaign trail among politicians and elected officials. But that is not the case for some students of color across the country and at home in Pennsylvania's 7th District. We must work together in Congress and in our communities to ensure that every student can reach their potential. By passing these two bills, we can move a little bit closer to fulfilling the promise of Brown versus Board for students in the 21st century and finally creating equal education opportunities for all. I am proud to support these bills, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Are there other comments on the amendment nature of a substitute? Gentleman from Maryland. It's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank you for your ongoing leadership and commitment to educational equality. It's been 65 years since Brown versus Board of Education, yet we still have persistent segregation and discrimination continue to plague our public education system today. You can walk into two public schools only a few miles apart in America and see the consequences firsthand. One school, typically serving predominantly high-income white students, has teachers and administrators with over 20 years of experience. The other, serving majority students of color, has an average teacher and administrator turnover of less than 3 years. One school with a low student to counselor ratio, the other, more police officers present than mental health professionals. One school with a robust after-school program with iPads. The other, no access to art class, but asbestos, mold lingering in the air. We're failing our children when we allow these inequities in resources to continue to exist in public schools today. We're failing our children when we allow an individual to lead the Department of Education, an agency that makes the decisions on behalf of 56 million students, a majority of whom are students of color, who has refused to admit before our committee that school segregation poses a threat to children of color. But here's what gives me hope. Our children have been leading movements and creating change throughout history, and they continue to do so today. Just last week, I had the opportunity to host a gun violence prevention panel featuring a brilliant student and advocate, Nate Tinbite. Another student in my district, Anya Takano, ran for Montgomery County Board of Education with the goal of increasing student diversity. Thanks to her leadership, a study is taking place to examine the zoning in all 207 schools in the county with the hopes of understanding how the school system might reduce overcrowding and increase diversity in all of our buildings. Her actions are not only changing our local education system, but influencing federal policy. I'm grateful I was able to work with my colleagues, Congresswoman Fudge and Chairman Scott, on the ANS to include language related to student voice and student engagement. We also included a provision to allow grants to be used in the development of innovative and equitable school assignment plans. I'd like to thank the leaders of this committee for choosing to formally discuss the issue after decades of inaction, and for taking the bold steps to bring us closer to fulfilling the promise of Brown versus Board of Education. I'm a proud co-sponsor of both of these great bills. I hope to see them move across the finish line. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further comments on the amendment nature of a substitute? Gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And listening to my colleagues and their eloquence, I just wanted to mention that, often we think in terms of the students who would benefit that are coming from economically disadvantaged areas. But the reality is that having the opportunity for students who may come from more affluent homes to have experience, to really get to know one another, to help them change the narrative about what the opportunities for students are across the board, essentially, is so important. I had an opportunity a number of years ago to run a program bringing students in from all over the city. And I think some of the greatest learning opportunities really came from those students who were economically advantaged and who had the different perspectives about how everybody is valued and the importance that they might have even someday, as well as their colleagues in the program, to make sure that decisions that they make in the future are very inclusive. Absent that opportunity to be together and to really get to know one another and to be more empathic for one another's background makes a real difference. So we want to be sure that we're not just thinking about students who are economically disadvantaged. Everybody benefits from that. It's not always easy to do that. I know as a parent, we certainly were involved in voluntary busing programs many, many years ago, and I know my kids benefited from that. They could have had a different experience, but that wasn't what they wanted, that wasn't what we wanted. So let's be sure that, we're seeing this in a really open light in terms of everybody who benefits. If we can't answer the question, is every child at this school, do they all have an equal opportunity to succeed? Then we haven't done our job. And that's what we're trying to talk about today, that there are innovations that are in schools throughout the country. Let's encourage all schools to be part of that. They can make a difference when they engage in that way, and we certainly know that exposing our teachers, exposing our young people to something that, ordinarily is not in their comfort zone. That's the whole idea here, and we need to be careful to move forward with all of that. So I support this, and I'm glad that we're working on it today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment nature of a substitute? If not, are there amendments to the amendment nature of a substitute? Gentleman from Georgia, Here's an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2639, offered by Mr. Allen of Georgia.
The amendment has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. Gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must be frank for amendment that I find it a shame that this substitute is even necessary. When we replaced the No Child Left Behind Act with Every Student Succeeds Act, we created the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants Program on a bipartisan, bicameral basis. We did this to provide school districts the flexibility they need to use federal funds as they see fit to meet local needs. As I've said many times, problems are not solved with heavy-handed political tactics and one-size-fits-all federal top-down solutions. It is solved by grassroots local efforts to solve these issues, always is and always will be. The federal government should work to remove obstacles to achieving the grassroots solutions by our local elected officials. It's disappointing that my Democratic colleagues didn't invite Republicans to the table to negotiate in good faith to build on that consensus. Instead, they are once again promising more federal spending that will probably never materialize, even in the unlikely event this bill is enacted and this new program is appropriated money. Its impact would be limited to the small handful of school districts that secure one of the competitive grants. Instead of proposing false promises, this substitute amendment offers a common-sense solution that could easily garner an overwhelming majority of votes on this committee. If every member chose to focus on the importance of this bill in honoring and implementing the legacy of Brown versus Board and not on scoring political points. This substitute amendment amends the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants programs under ESEA to explicitly allow school districts to use funds to develop or implement strategies to improve diversity and reduce or eliminate racial or socioeconomic isolation in public early childhood programs in public schools. This amendment also ensures that school districts are engaging with their communities to design programs that comply with federal law and have the support of parents and other constituents. And I have seen this happen in my district. It also alters requirements to distribute funds across multiple spending categories so that districts will have a sufficient funding to design effective integration programs. And the amendment uses the same language as the Magnet Schools Assisted Program under ESEA to ensure that school districts choosing to use funds for improving diversity can fund transportation activities that they see fit. I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands insist on your point of order?
I do insist, Mr. Chairman.
And the gentleman will state the point of order.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment offered by the gentleman amends a law not contemplated in the bill under consideration. It expands the scope of the bill and as such is not germane.
Thank you. Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Now, I understand the chairman would be within his rights to rule this amendment out of order. However, I would urge the chairman to allow this amendment to be properly debated and receive an honest vote. According to the majority, the point of this markup is to support school district efforts to improve diversity and reduce or eliminate socioeconomic or racial isolation. This amendment pursues the goal. It is true we achieve the goal differently than by underlying bill, but I would urge the chairman not to turn his back on the achievable bipartisan solution right in front of him in defense of a proposal going nowhere. Give the committee the chance to vote on this reasonable amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman's made a point of order that the gentleman's amendment amends a statute not amended by the underlying bill. The amendment offered by Mr. Allen amends the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 in such a way that it makes an allowable use to a pot of money that frankly the administration has sought to eliminate. Eliminate the amendment based on standing precedent of the House, the point of order amending a statute not under consideration is therefore not germane, and the point of order against the amendment is sustained. Are there further amendments? If not, the question is on the amendment in nature of a substitute. All in favor of the amendment of nature of a substitute will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. Does the gentleman from Northern Mariana Islands have a motion?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 2639 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendments be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on the reporting of H.R. 2639 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor of the motion will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, we request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The pursuant to committee rules, the proceeding on that will be postponed briefly. We now have two motions before us. It is now in order to consider postponed votes. The first will be on the motion offered by the gentlelady from Connecticut to report H.R. 2574 to the House of Representatives, the amendment in nature of a substitute, and recommendation that the bill agreed to, and the bill as amended do pass, on which the yeas prevailed by voice vote. Do you want to do these? Gentlelady from North Carolina, there's a suggestion that both be passed and that the votes be voted on in block, so we can vote on both amendments, both bills at the same time. If so, we'll have the motion made by gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands on the second bill, and both bills will be voted on at the same time. We're going to be voting on H.R. 2574 and 2639 en bloc. All in favor of both bills will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it, and the roll call on both votes is requested. Clerk will call the roll. And this is a vote on both bills en bloc.
Chairman Scott? Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Tucano? Mr. Tucano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Mrs. Lee? Mr. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no.
The clerk will read the names of those who have not voted.
Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye.
That's what I figured.
Mrs. McBath? Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mr. Castro? Mr. Rooney? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Walker? Sorry, can you repeat that? Mr. Walker votes no.
How is Mrs. Lee recorded?
Mrs. Lee is not recorded. Mrs. Lee votes aye.
How is Mr. Castro recorded?
Mr. Castro is not recorded. Mr. Castro votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 26 yeas, 20 nays.
Both of the bills are passed. Recognize Ms. Hayes for unanimous consent request. Oh, excuse me.
I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make the necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended pursuant to Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views.
That unanimous consent request will be made for both bills. If there's any objection, that objection so ordered. There being no further business before the committee,
Oh, not
Without-
bad. Oops.
without objection, the committee stands adjourned.